Support for this episode of Judaism Unbound comes from the Oshman Family JCC in Palo Alto, California, whose vision is to be the architects of the Jewish future. The Oshman Family JCC is an incubator for new expressions of Jewish identity. It creates innovative Jewish learning, celebrations, and arts programs that inspire personal connections to people and ideas from across the Jewish world. Learn more at www.paloaltojcc.org. This is Judaism Unbound, episode 93, Community of Communities. So new Judaism Unbound episodes are almost always released on Fridays. This one is no exception. Today is actually Black Friday, so if you're listening to us on your way to the mall, be safe out there. And we hope you had a great and enjoyable and meaningful Thanksgiving. Hopefully even maybe some of the ideas that we've talked about on Judaism Unbound in some way were on your mind during Thanksgiving. We generally make our plea for funding at the end of every episode, but we're going to do that at the beginning for the next few weeks because it's the giving season. A lot of people think about their philanthropic giving in December, and we are also looking at Giving Tuesday coming up in just a few days, and that's a day when the internet has organized itself to get people who have done a lot of purchasing on Black Friday and Cyber Monday to do a little giving back on Giving Tuesday, and we'd be honored to be part of that. We need to figure out ways to get more contributions, actually, because we're still not bringing in enough to really make this the great endeavor that we hope that it will be, and so every dollar that you give us will be used well, we promise you that. Judaism Unbound is part of the Institute for the Next Jewish Future, which is a 501c3 organization. So anything you give to us is tax deductible, and you can give to us by going to our website, www.judaismunbound.com/donate, and there are all kinds of options for ways that you can give. So thank you in advance. We really appreciate it. We really need your support, and we're really grateful. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Dan Liebenson.
And I'm Lex Rofberg.
And we are here today in the last interview in our series exploring Reform Judaism. We've been looking at a few examples of Reform synagogues on the ground that are working to innovate in different ways to be responsive to the needs of people that are living in their communities that are not necessarily interested in the typical offerings of a synagogue. And we've been really interested to see how the ideas of Reform Judaism may still be alive today and whether the Reform movement as a whole or individual institutions could potentially be the incubators through which new reforms are developed. We're excited today to welcome Rachel Timoner to Judaism Unbound. She is the rabbi of Congregation Beth Elohim, or CBE, in Park Slope, Brooklyn. CBE has been on a journey of reinvention for about a decade, and Rachel Timoner has been there for about 2 years. So we're going to hear some of the story of CBE before she came and also learn about the innovations that she has brought since arriving. Prior to coming to CBE, Rachel Timoner was the associate rabbi at the Leo Beck Temple in Los Angeles. And prior to becoming a rabbi, she has a long history of doing community work in San Francisco. She is a member of the Clergy Leadership Program of the Institute for Jewish Spirituality and the author of the book Breath of Life, God as Spirit in Judaism. Rachel Timoner, welcome to Judaism Unbound.
Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be with you.
Well, so we've been exploring now for quite a few weeks the story of Reform Judaism, the history of Reform Judaism in Europe, in America, and we've talked to some of the national leaders. And what we're looking to talk to you about today is kind of the on-the-ground view of all this and the synagogue level view of all this. And how does a Reform synagogue think about the changing ways that people are looking for Judaism or not looking for Judaism in our time? And we thought we could start with you're just telling us a little bit about the story of your synagogue, Beth Elohim, because its rebirth about a decade ago, I think really had a lot to do with recognizing some of the power of what we've thought about as disruptive innovation or innovation taking place outside of incumbent institutions. And Beth Elohim was particularly visionary in recognizing that early on and taking advantage of it.
About 10 years ago, I think maybe it was 11 years ago, CBE, as it's now called, hired Rabbi Andy Bachman to be its senior rabbi. And he, at that time, had built a whole community of young Jews called Brooklyn Jews. And this was a community that met in the park, and it met in cafes, and it met in people's houses, and it met in bars. And it was this grassroots gathering for Jews who were then in their 20s and 30s. They did study together, they did prayer together, they celebrated Shabbat together. And he chose to bring Brooklyn Jews with him when he came to CBE. The Brooklyn Jews kind of became a satellite of CBE, part of the community, and also Brooklyn Jews members some joined and some did not join as official members of CBE, but it became kind of part of a larger umbrella. And that was, I think, the beginning of when Beth Elohim became something of an open tent, in which you have a group of people who are members of the synagogue, and then you have others who are in a concentric circle around it, who are who think of themselves as part of the community. And that continues today.
So tell us a little bit more about what there is today, because, looking at your website, for example, I was really struck by the idea that although it is a Reform synagogue and a member of the Reform world, you also talk about it as a place where there are many different kinds of Jews. I don't remember the exact language, but all sorts of people are welcome. And I know that there are a number, for example, just of different religious communities that meet there that are not Reform. That's
true. CBE is a place that has these intersecting communities that think of it as home. And it's really unusual. So we have here a kind of identity as a community gathering place, as a neighborhood hub. And so, for example, when events happen in the world, whether that was Hurricane Sandy or whether that was the election last November, CBE opens its doors and the whole community gathers here. Jews and non-Jews, members and non-members, people gather to address whatever's going on in the world. Similarly, as you mentioned, we are a Reform congregation. I am a proud Reform Jew, and I'm very clear about that. And many of our members feel that same way. We also have members who would identify themselves as conservative Jews, and members who would identify themselves as secular Jews, non-religious secular Jews. We certainly have many members who are not Jewish. We have members who grew up in Orthodox communities. And we have, as you mentioned, we have a whole community of people called Altshul, which is a traditional egalitarian minyan that meets on site here and has for a decade and calls this place home. Some of the people in Altshul are full members of CBE, even though their practice is traditional in a way that's different than Reform practice. Others are not members of CBE, but are part of Altshul. And there's a real feeling of belonging. It's not just like, this is not a group that rents the space. This is a group that calls CBE home. And it's an interesting hybrid that I haven't seen anywhere else, where you do have a significant membership. We have about 930 households who are full members of the congregation, but then we have many other kinds of circles who think of CBE as home.
So can you tell us anything, if you know, I mean, both back in the day when all this was starting, but also today, I assume that you've been there about 2 years, is that right?
Yep, a little over 2 years.
So, it's probably well established by the time you got there, but were there tensions about this kind of approach? I mean, do you know how the thinking was that said, yeah, we really can be this place with multiple kinds of things going on?
I think that there was a real desire to revitalize the synagogue and create a feeling of relevance and vibrancy and energy. It was really transformational for the congregation to just kind of welcome in everybody. There were issues because some people looked at it and said, well, why am I paying membership dues if this other person can come and be here and be part of the community and they're not paying anything? And over time, that really did become a challenge, because one of the kind of value propositions of membership in a synagogue is that you have certain benefits that come with membership. You pay every year, and you believe in supporting the synagogue, and that's why you pay, but you belong to something, and it matters to belong to something. So that was a question that came up over that period of time. Another question that came up is, if we're trying to build an open place, an open tent, what is the center of that tent look like? In other words, if it's just about being open, is there also a center of gravity? Is there also something, an identity at the core around which people are convening?
So you've mentioned Brooklyn Jews and Altschul, which are beautifully both part of CBE and their own independent identities. Can you talk us through sort of other branches of CBE that might be part of that center of gravity of the tent and map for us what the different pieces are that make this community into what it is?
Yeah, I think there are two others that I would name. One is also during Andy Bachman's time, there was a real effort to reach and meet the needs of the Israeli community that's living in Brooklyn. And several different experiments were tried around addressing that community. And some of the things that continue today are, we have a dual language program in our early childhood center. Families can enroll their children, and one teacher speaks full-time in Hebrew and one teacher speaks full-time in English, and the children grow up completely bilingual. That now we're growing to be part of our Yachad program, which is our religious school program, so that people can choose a track that's a bilingual track in religious school. We also have something called Shira B'Shishi, which is a occasional gathering on Erev Shabbat that is Israeli-style Shabbat. It's a little taste of Kabbalah Shabbat, and it's mostly like a delicious Israeli dinner and a band and just time to gather as families and community. And that's been really popular with the Israeli community here. So that's kind of another circle of people who are kind of coming around CBE and thinking of the CBE as the place. If there's going to be any synagogue that Israelis are going to want to go to, like this is like a way for them to kind of put their toe in the water with synagogue life, even though that's often for the Israeli community not their first go-to. And then the other piece that I would say, especially in this last year, that's been really important in terms of the CBE kind of concentric circles is that, so when the election happened about a year ago, I was just flooded with pleas from my congregants asking me to gather people, asking me to make the synagogue available. I mean, within the first 5 hours of the election results becoming apparent. And so I reached out to our city council member, Brad Lander, who is a friend and is a progressive leader in our community, and said, hey, what are we going to do together? What are we going to do about this? And decided that we would open our sanctuary exactly 1 week after the election, on the Tuesday after the election, and opened by saying, okay, Shiva is over, and it's time to get up for mourning and to go out into the world and turn our mourning into action. That became what's known now as Get Organized Brooklyn. And at this point, more than 10,000 people have participated in that. And through it, the community has created about 15 different working groups over time on all kinds of issues related to defending human dignity and opposing hate and defending democracy, things like the free press, and caring for the most vulnerable, like standing with immigrants and standing against Islamophobia and standing against anti-Semitism and defending healthcare and women's rights and reproductive rights and et cetera. So this is a huge circle of people who are seeing CBE as a major part of their lives. We've been holding these gatherings roughly monthly since the election, and often have 1,000 people here when we do. So that would be another circle that I would define as a circle of people for whom CBE has become central to their lives and to their core concerns.
As you gave that list, I mean, it was beautiful to me what just happened, and I know it might be strange that I was latching onto this, but you just listed off 7 or 8 issues of the day that are like of deep societal importance, just like at the drop of a hat, in a way that makes it very clear to me, and I think anyone listening, that these are elements of your work on just a day-to-day basis. The way you said reproductive rights, countering anti-Semitism, countering Islamophobia, I love that those were consecutive, by the way. Immigrant rights. I mean, it was just, I can tell that this is not just something that your synagogue does as the 9th thing on its list, but is actually part of the work. And I guess, I mean, we've been talking about this general theme a lot because all over the Jewish press, there's been these articles asking sort of as an open-ended question, how do or even just do politics and religion like overlap? Should synagogues be spaces where political conversations happen? Should we avoid them? All this, and we've taken a side on that question. We've said that the question isn't should we be political in Jewish spaces. The question is how should we? And I'd love to hear more, because it's clear that you're doing all this work. How are you going about this? What does it look like to be that place of gathering on all of these political issues, and then I'm assuming to be part of channeling that gathering out into Brooklyn and into the broader world?
We have to make a space for politics within our Jewish lives, in our Jewish communities, in our definition of what Judaism is about. Either the Torah speaks to the issues of our time and is relevant and alive and vital, or it does not, and good luck creating or sustaining a future of Judaism. Either it has moral clarity that calls to us, that demands things of us, that requires that we respond to atrocities and forms of arrogance and sins of our time. Or if we think it doesn't, then what are we doing? The Torah itself was not devoid of politics. The rabbis did not ignore the political questions of their times. It would be wrong to try to strip Torah or Judaism from its very clear messages about human dignity, about the stranger. It is essential that we connect Torah to the political questions of our time. So how to do that? There are certain issues and sets of issues that feel to me to be more fundamental and pressing. Right now, I would say the one that feels most central is systemic racism and the way that it's running through our society. It's understanding its roots and understanding its manifestations and figuring out how we can be contributors toward dismantling it. That does not mean that standing for refugees or standing, against the attacks against women's bodies, and it does not mean that those are not important issues. They are, and they're also fundamental and important. But there is a tension between, for any institution, I think, and the relationship to its leader. And there has to be kind of a core set of commitments, and then there also has to be an openness for people to come and use the space to make other things happen. And that's the way that I've been operating around social justice. So we have here at CBE a community organizing group that focuses on racism. And it focuses on the ways that racism operates through the criminal justice system in particular. But ultimately, it will be focusing on a range of issues around racism. And it takes on one campaign after another, trying to change concrete things that are happening in our city and our state related to racism. So, for example, this month, we have a big action with District Attorney Eric Gonzalez, the new district attorney in Brooklyn, asking him to be accountable to us around the promises he's made related to systemic racism and the criminal justice system. Meanwhile, we've got Get Organized Brooklyn, where we've got these, I don't know how many it is now, there's many working groups somewhere in the teens of working groups that are working on everything from the list that I read out to you, standing against hate crimes. They're working on freedom of the press. They're working on issues around reproductive rights, etc. So we make space in the tent for all kinds of efforts and people who want to gather with one another around all kinds of efforts. And then we put our focus and attention on one or two key priorities where we're applying most of our people power and most of my attention.
So I guess my question becomes then, why isn't this happening everywhere in every synagogue across America? Why is this able to happen at CBE? And I guess the question sort of falls into two dimensions. One, is it that there's so many other synagogues in Brooklyn and in New York that people can comfortably say, look, if you don't agree with these politics, and if you don't want to be part of a synagogue that's fundamentally built around this political point of view, there are plenty of other synagogues close by that you could join, and so that's okay. We are saying that this is part of what defines us. Or is it saying, no, actually, we're defined by being this big tent, and if you don't really like this so much, that's okay, that you don't have to participate in it, and you can still feel part of CBE, even if you aren't so thrilled about that. And I guess, like, if it's the latter, again, where's the fear in other synagogues to say, like, look, probably the majority of Jews, conservative and reform, believe in progressive politics in the United States and feel fundamentally afraid and upset by Donald Trump and that whole agenda and want to work hard against it from a Jewish point of view. Sure, there's going to be a few people in every synagogue who don't want that, but why can't the rabbis and other leaders feel comfortable saying, there's also a lot of members who don't like our worship services, and so they only come on the holidays. It's fine, right? And so, but nevertheless, there seems to be more of a fear about going there, and more of a sense of a kind of, I guess, a more of an acceptance of the idea that's put forth by some folks that say, no, a synagogue should be kind of a refuge from politics, and Shabbat services should be a time when I can go for comfort rather than to go for politics.
We certainly have members who are not in agreement about certainly a lot of things that I say, but also things that we're doing. They don't want to be part of it. And it's for some, it's not their politics. They disagree. And for others, they feel exactly like what you just said, that the synagogue should be a sanctuary. It should be a place where we get away from all those questions. And we just focus on the spiritual. And we just focus on Torah in its kind of timelessness, not in application to this moment. My approach has been to say to those members, I want to hear you. I want to listen to you. I want to know where you're coming from. Let's set up time together. Let's sit down. You have a place here that's just as important as any other person's place here, and I want together with you to find the ways that you can feel like this is your home, even if you're not going to be part of the social justice work that's happening. But could we imagine developing the kind of courage as rabbis and as Jewish communal leaders in which we say, this is what Torah demands of me and of us, and not everyone here has to agree, and we're going to go do this. For those who are not called to do this with us, okay, come be part of our community anyway. And here are 10 other ways that you can find fulfillment here. As we start to play with this, there's so much possibility. Really, there really are so many Jews who are bored with the Judaism that's being offered them, who are alienated by God language that they don't connect to, by ritual that feels dead to them, by Torah that's remote and that no one has ever dug into with them to help them see the gems. They just don't get why we value it so much, because it does not seem to be either sacred or wise. And so there's just a huge translation project that's needed right now, like a deep translation project. The reason I'm a rabbi is I know that what we have in Judaism is so profound and so compelling, but many Jews just have never seen it before. The Judaism they've seen is not that at all to them. It is dull. And I think in the words of Abraham Joshua Heschel, I think he said dull and insipid. And I think that is a lot of what people experience Judaism to be. And it's frustrating to see the gap between those two things. For those of us whose eyes have lit up with Torah, and those of us whose hearts have been moved by deep tefillah to see other Jews who just don't know what we're talking about, it's really about translation.
That I couldn't agree more. I'm gonna shift gears a little, but then come back, I promise, to CBE. But I'm gonna start by asking about this Rabbis Roundtable that you've been a part of through the Forward. But basically, for listeners out there that haven't been following it, there's this new series in the Forward where they ask a question, and the questions have ranged in a number of ways to a bunch of rabbis. 17 rabbis one time, 22. I'm assuming however many respond to the emails out of the list that they have. And they just ask big questions, and they get a broad spectrum of what responses are. And I've read through them, and I've gotten so frustrated at so many of the responses, and then I've gotten to yours and been like very refreshed and happy on multiple occasions. I promise I'm not just saying that because you're guys like really. You've given like in some cases very quick 1 or 2 sentence answers that encapsulate a lot in them that could have a whole Talmud page, and I appreciate that. But I'm bringing this up not to go to any one particular question, but because I'm interested. My first reaction to this and many rabbi features, and it's funny because I'm studying to be a rabbi, but my first reaction to a lot of these things is often like, why are we just asking rabbis? Like, why do rabbis have a monopoly on educated, thoughtful answers to the question, what's the biggest threat to the Jewish people? That was the first question. Like, why don't we ask, to use a term we've used a lot of times, regular Jews? Like, why don't we ask whoever and see what comes up? Because I often find that rabbis, it's not that there's not broad diversity among rabbis, but as a very characteristic of having such rich Jewish education, it may mean that the answers you're likely to receive are from a specific subsection of what might be a broader set of answers outside of that. All that's to say, getting back to CBE, as I promised, you mentioned that there's all of these subgroups. There's all of these working groups. There's all of and I'm assuming because you are one human being, and I don't know, there may be assistant rabbis, there may be other staff, but like, I'm assuming if there's in the teens for working groups, the quantity of them, that you don't always have a rabbi in the room or a staff member, and that you're trusting members of your congregation to do a lot of this work. And I think that's so important because I gotta tell you, I see so many congregations where that's not the case, where if you're gonna do anything as just, congregant or member or whatever, you really need to get approval from the powers that be, from the rabbi, from whatever. And it sounds like, at least there's a hint that that's not the way it goes. And I guess I'd love to hear what that looks like for you, and maybe more broadly, what we should think about in terms of this rabbi role that we have in the 21st century and how it's changing, and maybe how that reflects on the role of all the rest of the Jews.
I agree with you. I think it would be fabulous to have roundtables of just Jews talking about the questions that the Forward is asking rabbis, because often rabbis are constrained in ways of what they can say or what they feel like they can say, that Jews, quote unquote, regular Jews might not, might be able to be a little bit more direct. And in that roundtable, I often was really brief because I felt like the questions were so big, and either I was going to write, a full-length sermon, or I might as well just say something to the point, like, here's my thought to the point, and not belabor it. The many working groups in Get Organized Brooklyn that you asked about, what happened was right after the election, when we gathered people at CBE to respond, to resist to what was happening, there were so many thousands of people, and there was so much energy that we realized that if we actually tried to control it in any way, we were going to slow it down and we were going to make it less powerful. And so instead, we just thought, you know what? People are smart. People are creative. People can self-organize. So we allowed people in the second meeting, we said, what do you want to work on? And anybody could come forward and say what they wanted to work on. And we trained a group of facilitators to be there so that they could at least facilitate the conversation. But basically what happened was people self-organized. If we had tried to run it ourselves, the whole thing, there was no way, as you're saying, there was no way we could be in all the rooms. There was no way we could follow up with all the minutes and all the next meetings. And these working groups, many of them met every single week for most of the year. This was an incredible amount of activity. And I think that that's instructive. I mean, it has its risks, right? Because at any point, anybody could have done anything in these working groups kind of in our name, without us knowing what it was and without us having the ability to approve it or not approve it. And that was really kind of risky. But people are smart and they have a lot of creative ideas, and they have, in some cases, a lot of motivation. And sometimes we need to get out of the way. Sometimes we just got to let people grow what they're going to grow and not control it so much. Now, in the regular operations of the synagogue, the truth is that we do actually need, and I think in the perfect model, we have a partnership between clergy or staff people and lay people, members of the congregation. I think that when we have a new initiative, if it's just run by members or if it's just run by rabbis or staff people, it's not as good as if we really build the relationships across those lines. So I wouldn't just say, anything goes, let's just like always have it be self-organized. I think that there is a real role for the professionals in a synagogue setting to partner with the lay people. But often what I see in synagogues is that the professionals run things and there's not really room for lay people to know how to partner, or in a lot of times in smaller synagogues, there's not enough professionals. And so it's just lay run. And I think that when it's possible, it's best to have that balance.
Do you think that we're going into an era where it seems that some of the ways in which synagogues have been differentiated from one another over time have been like denominational distinctions? And I wonder whether those distinctions are big enough in our day to sort of justify, so to speak, the different synagogues, and in a way, what I see going on in CBE is that it's this home for multiple ways of practicing, and maybe if you have a distinction in the way that you pray, well, we have a few different options that you can go to on Shabbat, but we kind of believe that. Really, in many ways, it seems like that's the only distinction between these Jews, and they can all get together to do social justice work together and to do just community building together. And I'm just sort of wondering, as we're in this series on the Reform movement, it's like, what are we really seeing here? Are we seeing a move from denomination to non-denomination or post-denomination? Are we seeing something happening or potentially happening within the Reform movement that says the Reform movement can move from being a denomination to being in some way the organizing principle, and so all the denominations in some way could move within the tent of the Reform movement because it's philosophically the most sort of open? Or, are there thoughts that you have about sort of what we might be seeing here in terms of Reform Judaism itself?
I don't think that we're moving to a post-denominational world. I really don't. And I could be wrong, but I feel as I'm in a place that is about blurring those lines. I mean, this place is really about saying exactly as you described, like, come be here together. And if you want to pray in a different kind of way, well, we'll set up a room for you and you can do that. But like, you can still be part of this community. It doesn't have to be the defining, it doesn't have to keep you out. But even in the midst of that, I become clearer and clearer that I'm proud to be a Reform Jew. And there are things about Reform Judaism that I would really miss if it all just blurred together. It's kind of like particularism and universalism, It's like I only can turn toward universalism because I know who I am. The more clear I am on my particularity, the more I can open-heartedly turn toward people who have a different particularism, And so that's how I think of it. And I wanted to say, as you were describing all these different groups coming together at CBE, you were saying like, we can come together to build community and we can come together to do social justice. And the other thing we can come together to do is study. We have this amazing Shavuot celebration, Tikkun, where all of the different minyanim in town, like the kind of independent minyanim and many of the different shuls across denominations, including Prospect Heights shul, which is a modern Orthodox shul, all come together here, and we spend the night together, and we have like 40 different workshops, and they're teachers from all the different places, and we open the night with everybody having Mariv in different rooms, and there's a room with a mechitza, which when that first happened here my first year, I thought, whoa, is this beyond what I can actually comfortably have in my building? Is a mechitza? Like, I have a lot of feelings about that. But I decided, okay, no, I actually, the pluralism is worth it. And then by the time, Mariv was over and we were off in different rooms studying with different teachers on different topics, I was so glad to have these unorthodox friends, neighbors, sitting in the same room with me and us looking at a text together. And that is so rich. So I do think there's so much room for us to be taking down the walls between the denominations, but that doesn't mean that they disappear. I never want to pray with mechitza, ever. I have zero interest in that, and I never will. But I'd love to study with someone who does.
For anyone who's not familiar, a mechitza is a separation between men and women in prayer services. But what are some of those pieces? I mean, you gave us a little bit of this, but when you think about how Reform Judaism does form part of what is the core of your community, because you've mentioned it is a key part of what your congregation is, what are those pieces that feel like, if you ditched affiliation with the URJ and became just a totally pluralistic congregation, like those are the things that you would really miss about, like, what are those pieces of reform, whether it's ideology or theology or practice or whatever, that make it possible for CBE to be what it is?
Well, first of all, and this is the obvious thing that everybody points to, is just the foundational commitment to social justice as a core, to the prophets and the prophetic voice as a core idea of what it is to be a Jew. I mean, that's the most obvious reason that I'm proud to be a Reformed Jew. But I would also say I appreciate the whole process of relationship to halakha and Jewish law, which we don't usually think about halakha and Reform Judaism as going together. But I appreciate that there is this emphasis on conscience and on deeply studying the sources of the halakha, trying them on and discerning, like, how ought I live that? Like, if this is a call on me, and I'm actually referring to some of the writings and teachings of Rabbi Richard Levy, who is a mentor of mine and is, that like to hear mitzvot as a call from God saying, this is important. I think he described it as God saying, this is important to me. Please take this seriously. But the idea of Reform Judaism saying to us, okay, these things are calling to us, and each of us in our own conscience needs to encounter them, needs to learn about them, needs to try them on, and then needs to find out, okay, how do I live this? And for some of the mitzvot, the answer is, it might be, I will not live it. I will not live it. Some, it might be, as Franz Rosenzweig taught, like, not yet, maybe someday, but I'm not ready yet. And for some, what it might mean is that I'm going to take the idea of this mitzvah, the essence of that I understand, that I intuit, that I study, that I learn is there, and I'm going to apply it in a way that other people looking at it might look and say, like, oh, you're not really doing that. But I'm going to apply it in a way that brings out the meaning of it. So whether that's about doing things on Shabbat that are about the experience of refreshment and renewal, but that violate a rule of Shabbat. So things that violate halakha, but that are expressions of embracing life, of being in touch with what makes you grateful, of doing things that renew you. That would be an example of a way that I see the Reform movement, because of its openness around mitzvot, making possibilities for renewal of Jewish life.
So when we launched this podcast about a year and a half ago, our first interview was with Rabbi B'nai Lappi, and that was very intentional, very much looking at her theory of crash. But just as importantly was, I think, some instinct that we had that the way that she's going about thinking about Judaism comes from having this kind of outsider's perspective. And I'm curious about you, as famously one of the LGBTQ rabbis who is now leading a non-LGBTQ congregation. Like, I don't know what we call that. What the terminology is, a mainstream congregation. And that number is growing and growing. And we're starting to see that happening in the way that a generation earlier, women started to have roles at leading major congregations. And I'm just curious if you could reflect a bit, if that at all is sort of part of a process that's going on here that's really important and that should be recognized, because I have an instinct that it really is. And, that there's so many that, I tend to be a little bit kind of wary about rabbis, but I would say 9 out of 10 of the rabbis that I hear and I say that could be my rabbi is somebody who's coming from the LGBTQ world. And so I'm wondering if there's really actually something deep there that we could identify.
When a person has come out as LGBT, there's been a process of self-searching, and there's been a process of truth-telling that can often be really deep and face, it involves facing one's biggest fears of exclusion and rejection and isolation. And so I think that out of that process comes a sensitivity to diverse experiences, a refusal to put up with falsehood, like an intolerance for falsehood. Because if you're going to risk everything to tell your truth, it's like after that, it's pretty hard to put up with things that aren't true, and a willingness to take risks. And so I think that those could be factors. And I also think just being, like you said, like being an outsider, like knowing what it is to be outside the camp, and knowing that there is a camp and you're not in it. And then finding a way into the camp, being able to be who you are, there, I think, is a real appreciation and awareness of who's outside the camp, and like always, who's outside the camp, like, because I don't want anybody to be outside the camp who doesn't want to be outside the camp. And I think that probably a lot of LGBT people have that just kind of intuitively, just like inside us, because we know what it feels like. But I think that a lot of religious life can be about discovering and uncovering and taking off the layers of who am I and what is my place in this world. It's a process of becoming more self-aware. And so for people who've gone through often a grueling process of becoming self-aware, there's a natural fit in making a space to facilitate others to do that process for themselves, to put down any falsehoods they're carrying, to take away all the veneer, and to get down to the deepest parts of what their truths are, and to help them live more fully realized in the world. That is a big part of what coming out is saying, I'm not going to be limited by this. I'm going to be me, and I'm determined to bring what I have to bring to the world and not let anybody stop me. I feel like probably, I don't know, 75% of my sermons have something to do with that each person has something to offer this world. And there are all kinds of things holding us back, whether those are learned patterns of behavior, or whether those are injustices, or whether those are forms of exclusion, or those are ideas we've inherited about what success looks like. Or there are many, many things that hold us back from being who we're meant to be in the world. And I do think that part of what it is to have a relationship with God and to be a religious person is to settle for nothing less.
Thank you so much for joining us and helping us continue to think about, the reform movement and social justice and all of these themes that have been floating around in our podcast for a while. I think you've really helped us hone in on some concrete teachings for us to apply as we move forward. But before we go, is there anything else that you would want to just bring to our listeners out there about Judaism, about the world, that they should hear as they go about their daily lives?
Yes. One thing I want to say is I think that one of the roles of the synagogue as we move forward is going to be about the intersection between spiritual life and social justice, like really explicitly. How does one sustain work for social justice when the conditions seem dire and bleak? How does one sustain hope instead of anger or hate? How does one day by day continue to see the faces and voices and inherent dignity of all human beings when we're bombarded with news all the time of suffering? We need spiritual practice to sustain that. I worked for 14 years in social justice work, separate from spiritual life, just social justice work, before realizing that I needed to go into the rabbit, and that was my calling, and that I needed to unite my spiritual life and my social justice work in order for them to make sense. So I think that we have a particular role to play in synagogues of nurturing people who are distraught at the state of the world, to be able to keep getting up and going out there to make the world more whole. And I actually think this connects very much to the conversation about Brooklyn Jews and what makes it so vibrant, because it is right now, it is thriving, is that the idea of cultural Judaism as a legitimate and important area of study, that that if we were to treat the culture of Judaism and of the Jewish people as something worthy of delving into, like we delve into Torah, that would attract and engage, and does attract and engage, a whole sector of Jews who are not interested in God and who are not interested in Torah as they've ever understood it to be, but who are interested in Jewish music, in Jewish art, in Jewish history, in Jewish politics, who would be drawn together. And if we are able to really focus on culture in a serious way, I think we'll see a renaissance among not only millennial Jews, but also empty nest and older Jews who have these alienations from what they see as traditional Judaism that they think really doesn't speak to them, but culture does.
Thank you so much, Rachel Timoner, for joining us. This has been an awesome conversation.
It has been an awesome conversation. Thank you.
And thanks again to all of you out there listening. This has been a fantastic set of episodes with guests from the Reform movement, and our next one is going to look back at all of those and try to synthesize what we've learned, and then we'll keep on rolling to our next set of topics. So we want to close out this episode in the same way that we always do, by encouraging you to be in touch with us, and there are a few ways for you to do that. First, you can head to our Facebook page, Judaism Unbound. Second, you can check out our website, judaismunbound.com. And last but not least, you can hit us up via email at dan@judaismunbound.com or lex@judaismunbound.com. The last plug we like to make is that you can always support us financially with either a one-time gift or a monthly recurring donation, and you can do either of those at judaismunbound.com/donate. So thanks so much for listening, and with that, this has been Judaism Unbound.